off with what brought about Irv Muchnick's work and what brought about this renewed investigation, and then we got to talk about why did it take this fucking long?
Yeah, I mean, so the obviously the situation, the death of Nancy Argentino was in 1983, and a couple of years later, I was in Florida and I met one of Nancy Argentino's sisters at I don't even remember exactly where I was, and it was actually, I was talking to her boyfriend, who was a professional wrestler at the time. And then in the course of the conversation, she mentioned to me, my sister's Nancy Argentino. And I go, wow. It's like, and we talked for like, quite a while when she just brought it up. It's kind of like wow, that's interesting. And then she kind of told me, the story of what happened. I mean, I'd heard the stories at the time, but I didn't know the details. And she kind of told me the details. And I believe that I actually, at one point, told her, Muchnick in conversation, I met Nancy Argentino's sister, and there was a lawsuit filed by the family, and they wanted default judgment, and they never got paid. So there's something to this. So he went head on. He went to Allentown in the early 90s, talked to everyone he could. The people at the building slammed the Ag Hall slammed the door. He was the New York outsider coming into Allentown to investigate their little town secret, right? So that happened, and he wrote a story, and there were other stories, and he ended up, as the years went by, becoming very good friends with the two sisters, Lorraine and I forget the other one, Louise and Lorraine, and so he was always on the case. And then the thing I think that really brought it back was two things. Number one was Snuka published an autobiography in 2012 where he talked about it and said that he never did anything, and that she died, but she peed on they stopped the car on the way to Allentown. She peed on the road. She slipped, hit her head on a rock or something. They went to the city. To the motel. She wasn't feeling well, but everything was fine. And he comes back to the room after wrestling that night, and she's dying. He calls 911. He never hit her or anything like that. And then the sisters were furious, and other people, I guess, were furious as well. And at that point, that happened. And then the next year, in 2013, the Allentown paper did a front page story, which was the 30th investigation.
The Morning Call, right?
The Allentown Morning Call did. It was a great story, and it was the 30th anniversary of the death of Nancy Argentino. This, unsolved death of, in the motel room with this famous celebrity wrestler in their town, and it had a lot of information. It was very difficult to get information this whole 30 years because the police always labeled it as an ongoing investigation, even though after 2 weeks after the death, they never did anything. So, but because it was an ongoing investigation, they were able to use confidentiality to keep all the records that they had sealed, so nobody really could find.
That's the important point to make. Even though, like you said, after a couple of weeks after the incident, they never did anything else. The investigation never went anywhere after that, and there was no active effort, but they never closed the case, because if they closed the case, people could get a hold of all the records, right?
Right. So, but somehow, in doing so, the local paper got the autopsy report where the coroner said that this needs to be investigated as a homicide, and that was somewhat the smoking gun, because it kind of like embarrassed the local authorities that here the coroner who investigated it said that, and also there was no, like, if she had fallen by the side of the road and hit the back of her head, there would be like little particles of gravel and things like that, and there was nothing like that. And the other thing that had never come out was that there were bruises all over her body. I mean, it wasn't like she just, bumped the back of her head. She had bruises on her arms and different places, which, would, in theory, be, that there was a fight or something.
Were consistent. The injuries were consistent with what you would see from either somebody who's been in a fight or victim of domestic abuse.
Right. So when that happened, because of that story, the new DA there said, we're going to open up this investigation into this. And I thought, and I think most people thought, that they're doing that because the newspaper said it's a 30-year-old case, and it's public posturing. Nothing's going to happen. And nothing did happen for 18 months. It was supposed to go on after a year. They were supposed to have their results, and they said, well, they didn't give results. They said we're going to go another 6 months with the investigation. So I figured, well, they think it's a little too soon, and people will get mad. They're going to come up with nothing. So now they're delaying the inevitable, right? So then they go 6 months, and then nothing happens again. And then the thing is we've got another month after the 6th before we have to say anything. So we're thinking, like, they're just delaying this thing. So then the day comes out, and then they indict him on, the charges. So, and they released, a lot of their evidence, and it was, so when it's over and you read all the evidence, the thing that just hits you like a brick is almost all this evidence was there 30 years ago. There was the new evidence was an interview that Snuka did on a radio show and his book, and there was a couple of people who came forward during the course of their investigation with news stories. I mean, one of the key ones was the wife of the widow of Buddy Rogers, who was next door neighbors to Snuka, who didn't even know about the Argentino case, but did know about Snuka and his own wife, saying that his wife at the time, Carol, had come over to her house all bloody and, from allegedly being beaten. And so she was kind of, so in the thing, they also investigated the incident in Syracuse that people won't know. It was a couple months before where Jimmy was dragging Nancy around by the hair, and the police came, and Snuka fought off 8 police and 2 dogs before they finally apprehended him, which was actually
well, now hold on. Let's not gloss over this because that is another thing that just smacks you in the face. It wasn't that he was dragging her around by the hair. The police were called because they were making enough of a disturbance, and there was people screaming and yelling, Snuka and Nancy Argentino, whoever, that when the cops got there, it was still a hot enough situation, an active situation, that Snuka, naked, was dragging Nancy Argentino naked down the hallway by her hair in a hotel.
And I mean, the thing is, I mean, when you talk about an active situation, there were cops that came, and they saw him. And you remember what Jimmy Snuka looked like in 1983.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was a, super, 250-pound, super muscular guy. And they took one look and they said, hey, I mean, they didn't go after him right away. They said, we need backup. So it ended up with 8 people and 2 dogs, or not, 9 men and 2 dogs actually showed up. And then they, after a struggle that involved, the dogs biting and all this, they took him in, and he paid a fine, and that was that. But that happened months before her death. So it was kind of like in the course of what they gave to the grand jury, you had this incident where there was a domestic abuse thing with his wife that was alleged a couple of months after her death, and then the incident in Syracuse with her before the death. So it created a pattern there. But I mean, the whole thing, when you read all of the evidence, I mean, even if you throw that stuff out that I just said, and you just read the reports from the coroner and what Snuka had told different people that night, you would go in there and go like, you would have to seriously investigate this case.
How much shit happens? How many cases are pressed in court every day on a sliver of amount of evidence, as opposed to this that didn't go anywhere? Is the whole point of it?
Right, and the thing is he told like several different stories, and I mean the whole thing is when I read everything, this is the way I interpreted what happened. Okay, so the night he comes back from wrestling that night at the TV tapings, and she's in bad shape. They call 911. They come in there, and Jimmy is at this point, I think, telling the truth as much as he knows it, saying that something happened. I pushed her. She fell. She hit her head. So.
But it was a playing around type of thing. That I've just just pushed and
maybe not even. Okay, so maybe not even that. But he tells that to the police officers. Now he gets to the hospital and he tells the nurses a story, and I think he's trying to be honest, because it's like she's in rough shape and obviously he doesn't want her to die.
Right.
So he's being as honest as he could without burying himself, so to speak. Well, then she dies. Okay. The next morning, I mean, he's got a completely different story. That's the peeing on the side of the road story, because it's like she's dead, and you know what I mean?
Well, and now he's also had time to think of something.
Or someone thought for him.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about the difference between 1 a.m. and look, Jimmy was the you know, at the time, Jimmy was the biggest star in the company at the time. So, you know, you're I don't think he's doing this on his own, and Fuji's in the room with him while this is all going on. And you know Fuji, right? Fuji went right to Vince McMahon, without a doubt. So, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind Vince McMahon was aware of this. What happened between Vince and Snuka between whatever it is, 1 a.m. and 10 a.m. the next morning, I have no idea.
It also makes sense because Fuji would have been the guy in the hotel room, or not in the hotel, but in the hotel. Fuji would have been the guy that any of the guys would have gone to as a veteran, as you know, old Uncle Harry, as what do I do? Give me some advice, or at least to be there. And then obviously Fuji would have gone straight back to Vince, if not in person, by phone or whatever. So he would have known about it shortly afterwards. And you know, last week on the program, this is one of the things. Last week, when I started talking about it, I prefaced it for like 2 minutes with, you know, hey, I was a huge Jimmy Snuka fan when I first saw him for Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, and before I got in the business, when I could, you know, go to Cincinnati and see him live, and what an amazing athlete, and what the scariest looking, toughest looking. You thought he was the baddest guy on the planet. He just had that look, and I spent a long time saying, you know, I was a fan of his and how great he was, and etc. But is he the Bill Cosby of wrestling? Is nobody wanted to believe this shit because they were blinded by celebrity and fandom and whatever, but all of a sudden, this more of the shit comes out, the more it's like, hey, you know, seriously, this case, obviously, if it had happened to anybody else, even if they weren't guilty, they'd have probably got convicted. And this never even got pressed. And what about the story of why would you put in your book that if you got away with murder, why would you write a book? And did the WWF have anything, or E have anything to do with the book being released?
It was not a WWF book. Yeah, but Jimmy in the book says that, you know, Vince McMahon came 2 weeks after there was a big meeting, or a big you know, the police, Jimmy and Vince were all in a room, and Jimmy says, you know, Vince came in with a suitcase, whatever that's supposed to mean, you know, whatever.
And didn't leave with it, right?
Well, that I don't know.
That's the inferred.
But
he came in with a briefcase, right? That he's actually given clues in his own book. Why would you do that?
Yeah. And it essentially said, like, I don't know, did he, you know, Jimmy in his own book did say, like, I don't know if he paid off the family or not. And I mean, I guess from what I understand, the mother has claimed that she was called and was offered $25,000 by the company, which, you know, she said, screw it, because that's when it was like, you know, they had hired a private investigator immediately because they didn't buy the, you know, the story. And the private investigator came back to him and said, you know, he didn't buy the story either, but he didn't think he could win the case against them and take their money, but he did go to the
maybe he took
attorney.
the 25 grand. Maybe the private investigator took the 25.
No, but he went to the district attorney and he was going like, you need to prosecute this, and he just said that he was like completely stonewalled, and he couldn't understand why he was stonewalled because all the evidence that he had indicated it should be prosecuted. Then the family hired a second attorney. They did file suit. They won a $500,000 judgment. And then Snuka claimed bankruptcy, you know, and he had no money, and they never got any money out of that.
How do you remain a fairly public citizen for most of the last 30 years and actually appear on television in one form or another for one promotion or another and still never have to pay a penny of a legal judgment against you?
I don't know, but OJ's the same thing.
Well, that's true.
You know, I mean, OJ never paid.
He's not making much money in the prison laundry these days, but
no, but and I mean, you know, I'm sure his economic situation got really bad at certain point, but he was still making a lot of money from his NFL pension all those years, you know, before he got, you know what I mean?
But here's the thing, besides the judgment, etc., just the idea that once again, he could be a public person for 30 years or whatever, and nothing more is done. I get some of the same people, and this is what gets me, some of the same people that came to this original conclusion in Allentown 30 years ago are still involved. What's the guy's name? Procannon, but
Procannon was still around. What's key to this investigation that's so interesting is, this is 32 years later. And so you would think that, the nurses and things like that, so many of them would have passed away. And there are people involved in the case. One of the detectives who actually contacted Irv Mushnick, who had told his son, how frustrated he was that this thing wasn't prosecuted. And the son, I told Irv Mushnick, that his dad would have been happy when he heard about the indictment a couple of weeks ago. But he had passed away, but most of them hadn't. And most of them were still in one of them is now, a respected judge who's the guy who actually made the call not to prosecute. Procannon still, he's actually a higher ranked detective, and he was actually the guy in charge of this investigation, which is so interesting because at first, he was the one defending the original thing, and when he was put in charge of this investigation, I remember Irv Mushnick telling me, because Irv Mushnick said that the guy lied, but Procannon lied to his face and just said that, there's only, Jimmy Snuka only told one story and that was it. But Procannon told other reporters different stories, including the Allentown paper guys. He had told them how he thought it went down in 2013, the nature of how the shove was and things like that. But anyway, when he was named the head of the investigation, it was another thing where we were going this is some public thing that they're just going to, basically say we were the Warren Commission, right? We were right all along. But it didn't turn out that way. I was stunned that morning when those indictments came because it was for 19 months, it's just okay, I know how this ends. You know what I mean?
But at the same time, now that's kabuki-ish to me. That some of the same, especially one of the main guys that said, "Oh no, don't do anything about this." 30 years ago, he's still involved in the case. Does he want to see a conviction, even if it's a just one, because that would prove that he was an idiot 30 years ago, or is he trying to right some kind of wrong that he has changed his mind? I'd be a little nervous about having the same people involved that has taken 30 years to get to this point.
Well, the guy who made the call not to prosecute, who's now a judge, he's completely out of it. But the detective, 30 years you go through, you may go through a lot of phases, and again, it's maybe at some point, who knows what's going through their head? It's again, it wasn't even Allentown; it was actually Whitehall. So it's a small town. And, Vince McMahon and WWE, they come into Allentown every 3 weeks. They put on shows. Jimmy Snuka's, he was a weird kind of celebrity, as you'll understand this. He was a huge celebrity, but at the time, he wasn't, that wrestlers weren't celebrities, but they were in 1983, if you know what I mean.
They were celebrities to the large amounts of people that watched the TV shows and went to the matches, but they got very little mainstream publicity for the general populace that wasn't into wrestling.
Right.
So they were bigger stars to the wrestling fans 30 years ago, but they were smaller stars to the average public. Maybe that's how they used to get away with all this shit.
In a way, I consider they were bigger stars because they were actually bigger stars, but they got reported on less. Is how I always would consider it. So because it's like this stuff. If this stuff had happened today, it would have been a national news story. A famous, again, like Snuka could be the equivalent of probably Cena, or maybe right underneath. And if something like that happened, it'd be gigantic. But then, when Nancy Argentina died, I remember the New York paper. It was like a graph one day in the paper that a woman died in the hotel room with Jimmy Snuka, and that was it, and nothing was ever said again.
What is Snuka's condition these days? Because we know he's had the stomach cancer, and he's been known throughout the years for playing. I think even one of the detectives said he was playing the dumb island boy, and Vince was doing the talking.
Right.
I know he was at WrestleCade last November and pacing around, and I said hello and passed a few words and seemed to be fine. Has his condition gone rapidly downhill, or is he potentially milking that like that old mob boss that used to walk around the streets in Brooklyn in his pajamas to avoid prosecution?
Yeah, I just know that when the story came out. His lawyer in Allentown said that, he's suffering from dementia. And then I had people go, okay, I talked to him, a month ago. I talked to him 3 months ago. And, you can have a conversation with him, and that's just not right. Jimmy, would not take the stand, and it would be during the investigation. He never spoke, and probably just because he had so many contradicting stories from different people, it would have probably been a disaster had he done it. So it was probably in his best interest not to. But
promos were never his strong point anyway. To begin with.
But I mean, as far as the dementia aspect goes, I think that's greatly overplayed, he's suffering from stomach cancer. That's one of the reasons why they didn't keep him in prison, and they set bail for him to get out, because it was he needed medical care, and what would end up happening is the state would have to pay for all his medical care if he was in prison the whole time. So, and they didn't think that. They didn't think he was at risk to be running or anything like that. So they set bail at $100,000.
Well, I tell you, once again, was a big fan, etc. And it's another one of the boys, and you hate to see the boys get sideways. And if this was, it's I don't even know if it's a benefit of the doubt thing, because if this was the only incident that had ever been reported, well, everybody can fuck up, and were they drunk or whatever, and blah blah blah. But when obviously there was a pattern not only with the same girl but also with his wife, and Buddy Rogers even made the comment at one time, I think, well, he's the sweetest guy in the world, but when he's on the shit, which everybody was in those days in wrestling practically at the top, he turns into Jimmy Snuka turning into an animal in those days would not be something you'd want to fucking see.
No.
Buddy, with all of that different, go ahead.
Yeah, Buddy knew him pretty well, because you remember Buddy was with him not just in New York, which people know, but also in the Carolinas.
Right. I think that's how they got put together in New York, was because they did it in the Carolinas, right?
Yeah, and then the other thing too is, okay, so when Nancy Argentino passed away, Jimmy's family was still living in the Carolinas. Okay, and he was working in New York, in the Northeast Territory, WWF. Now, after that, they moved. Now, they moved to Haddonfield, New Jersey. I don't know if it was next door or, 2 houses down from Buddy. So it's like, if you're, that tells you how close you are. If like you're, let's just say, you're in the old days, like, you're going from territory to territory, and you're not, your family's in different territory, and it's kind of like, whatever reason, you move your family up because you're doing great in the territory and you're going to stay, or whatever the reason is. Maybe the wife got mad that this came out and wants to make sure she's there.
Right.
We're going to move next door to another wrestler. It's probably going to be someone you're really tight with. It's not going to be someone, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So they were tight, but at the end, obviously, it was over, the situation with the wife. Buddy and Jimmy were not tight at the end, and that was the reason why.
Well, I just, like I said, everybody wants to give the celebrity the benefit of the doubt, and is he the Bill Cosby of wrestling? With all of this stuff going on, the worst you can say is obviously he didn't mean to do it, or the best you can say is obviously he didn't mean to do it if he did it, blah, 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 allegations, whatever, but that many incidents in really a short period of time, you got to think he may have been fucking out of control on the shit, and if so, well, that's terrible, but it's his fucking fault ultimately. So, if I was Nancy Argentino's family, I would be, at this point, more angry at the people who prevent this for 30 years, or who didn't press it, or didn't get anything done about it for 30 years, than I would be against the guy that actually did it, I think.
Yeah, well, all I know is that that's still like the big unanswered question, because when you look at the evidence and the statements and things like that, it all pointed right to him. There's people who go, well, they didn't have enough for a conviction, but the fact that they just stopped after 2 weeks investigating, it's like, that's kind of, I don't know. Then the coroner himself said, I had suspicion, but I didn't have enough for a conviction, because the key that he said was, I can prove, that there were marks on her body and that he probably did the marks, but were those the blows that killed him, killed her? I can't prove that. But it was a death from a blow to the back of the head. So at worst, if he didn't hit her in the back of the head, and he probably didn't, it probably was hitting something on the way down, but whether it was a shove or what it was, it still was something that